Hello, everyone. This is Devin Musgrave, your host for today. Welcome to the webinar, Sequence Your Value Delivery with Impact Mapping. Today's webinar is the third in a series of 5 webinars addressing how to deliver value in your software development efforts. The first was why Agile missed expectations. The second was 6 steps for defining product value, and you can find both of these on YouTube. Today's webinar is presented by Jenny Stewart, Construx's VP of Consulting. Jenny will present another webinar, Optimize Your Value Delivery by Quantifying Stakeholder Needs, in April. We'll have a Q&A session at the end using the Q&A app inside Teams. Look for the icon with a question mark inside a word balloon and feel free to type your questions whenever you like. By the way, you can also choose the Turn on Live Captions option here in Teams if you find that helpful. This webinar is being recorded, and we'll share a link to the recording later. Thanks for joining us, and take it away, Jenny.
Thank you, Devin. Great to be here today. Excited to share impact mapping and how that can have an effect on value delivery. My name is Jenny Stewart. I'm the Vice President of Consulting at Construx Software and have helped people implement new practices, processes, and approaches around the world. And always love to have the opportunity to talk about how do we make what we're building more useful, more valuable, provide better support for our business partners, our users, and our clients. So this is a topic near and dear to my heart. All right, today what we'll cover is why we should consider value. What are some of the things that happen in our industry that have us maybe looking at something that isn't as value oriented, and why we should be thinking about this. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about the landscape of value techniques. There's certainly more than impact mapping out there, hence the reason that we have 5 webinars in this area, not just one. Then we'll dig in and I'll explain what impact mapping is, and we'll talk about how impact mapping can help you sequence your value after you've completed it. So why even consider value? It seems like sometimes a project can feel like we start and it's relatively simple. There's just a few features that people want. And then as we get going, there's more ideas, more requests, more. We had a VP of engineering once who described it as our projects go along, and the phrase we often use inside is, and while we're on it, we should also. So what starts with a few things that seems like we could easily prioritize them ends up feeling like you're almost drowning in feature requests from our stakeholders, our business partners, product management, other parts of the organization. And I joke a lot with people that capacity never exceeds demand. There's always more demand, more ideas, more things people want. I had a client once who said, well, we just need to double our staff. And I said, I tell you, if you double your staff, you will simply triple the desire for more things to be built out of the organization. One of my favorite phrases in this area is a client I worked with once called it ruthless prioritization. We almost universally need to ruthlessly prioritize. And we often ruthlessly prioritize by talking about, is feature A more important than feature B? But is that really even the right discussion for us to be having? Do features really reflect user value? I bet many of you out there have seen the chaos reports that have been happening for years and years and years, and they talk about, have we delivered our project on time? Have we delivered it on budget? Does the project outright fail? And in 2015, they asked a really interesting question that I thought was one of the more important questions we really should ask is, so we delivered it, maybe we delivered it late, maybe we delivered it on time, but did our users actually think it was valuable? Or did we deliver it on time and they said, great? Or back when I started working with organizations in Agile in 2003, the first team I worked with actually moved to Agile because they would typically deliver things, say it was a 12-month schedule, they delivered after 15 months, and the users would say, well, that's not really what I even wanted and needed. So they wanted that opportunity for more feedback and that opportunity for us to be able to steer the product that we were building to really meet their needs. So it's a little depressing to me to look at and say the 2015 data says 41% of the projects that got delivered weren't considered valuable, right? That's a lot of effort, resulting in people saying, thanks. Maybe you built what I wanted you to build, but you didn't really solve my underlying need and what I wanted to accomplish. And size does matter here. So if you look at the value return for small projects versus the value return for large projects, the data definitely says that large projects, you're looking at only 18% being highly valuable or very highly valuable for large projects. So with everything, size is a factor in software. Everything gets more complicated, including our ability to manage and deliver the project to actually deliver value. And it's an interesting study to talk about, um, you know, is satisfaction and value greater if we deliver more features? Actually, I really don't think that's the way to think about it, right? I don't want features when I look at software. I want to be able to accomplish something, or I want you to solve some kind of fundamental problem. Features are simply the mechanism we use to go about solving those problems, or at least hopefully the mechanism we use to go about solving those problems. So yes, a feature is a vehicle we need in software, whether you call it a feature, an epic, a capability, a project. But we really need to make sure we're focusing on what our users need and want to accomplish, their use cases, or if you've heard Earl Beatty talk, the value paths. Really, the why behind what we're building this is incredibly important to make sure that we're all aligned together and we're moving in the same direction, and we're going to produce something that really delights and supports what our users need and want. So the landscape. Value is nothing new. And honestly, it's one of the whole reasons that many organizations initially moved to Agile. It was the ability to deliver more value more quickly. Instead of having a project that takes 6 months or 9 months or 12 months, why don't we have sprints of 1 to 4 weeks? And at the end of those 1 to 4 weeks, we can produce working software, we can get our users feedback, we can make sure that we optimize, and when we do, that's absolutely perfect. I think that's great. The problem I see is in many organizations and in many businesses, just having a Scrum team with a product owner isn't necessarily enough. They might not have a big enough understanding of the landscape. They might not have the authority to be able to talk to people outside the organization they would need to. So if just Scrum or Kanban or XP, if that alone solved the problem, we really wouldn't even be here talking today. It still continues to be a challenge today. I do think that Agile definitely gives us that opportunity to course correct more often, to have more opportunities to do reviews, to do feedback. We just really need to make sure a couple things. One, we're all aligned on what direction we're going, and impact mapping will help us be there. And then two, we really make sure that we divide the work that we're going to do in a way that we can build it so that we can incrementally deliver and validate user value. If I'm halfway through a project and I don't have half of my user value to get feedback on, that really undermines my ability to gather that feedback and course correct as we go. So we really ought to be thinking about value in a couple of different ways. User stories, I think, are a wonderful way of thinking about value. I often think of those as thinking about value in the small. Often we're thinking about user stories that we're building for our next sprint, and that's just one piece of what we're doing. And there's lots of other pieces and parts here. Our DevOps pipeline, that opportunity to deploy things. A/B testing, that opportunity to check, do people like this particular way we present it, or this particular functionality? Does it lead to more conversions or more sales? Telemetry data that we can actually collect to look at, did what we built get the desired outcomes that we wanted? Those are really good. I think of those almost as sort of tactical tools that we can use along the way. We want to also build upon those by, when we're researching our project or our releases, thinking about things like personas. Who are the users who are actually going to be using these things? I'm doing design, user-centric design that centers around what people want to do with the system. Doing things like task analysis, really understanding how do people use it? What context do they use it in? I will probably build a very different system if I understand that nurses don't tend to go to one patient, do all their work with one patient, and then go back to a central area. They have a very interrupt-driven kind of lifestyle. They may get called away really quickly. And so being able to have something that's more portable, being able to have something that's in each room so that they can make notes as they go, kind of save those off and have those not end up disappearing or having them have to carry around huge stacks of paper before they finally make it back. Really sympathizing and understanding. I think all of these techniques really give us a better grasp on what we're going to be building. But we want to make sure that we also have a really good understanding of why are we building what we're building and what is the smallest piece that we actually need to build. So understanding things like stakeholder goals and how we're going to quantify those, being able to really concretely say, this is what somebody wants. And not just a general, well, I just want it to work better, or I want it to be usable. What does usable even mean? Being able to nail those down and really quantify those, I think is incredibly helpful. And impact mapping, using that where you can say, well, what are we trying to accomplish? What is that goal or set of goals that we're trying to accomplish? And how do we link what we're building back to that particular goal? You may have joined us for Bob's first webinar, which was Unleashing the Potential of Agile. He talks a lot about this image of what the customer asked for, what we actually wrote down in requirements, what the architecture created, what we designed, what we built. And sometimes what the customer asked for isn't really even what they wanted. What they really wanted was they wanted to relax outside. And well, we built a tire swing for them, and they were okay with that. Our customer is crushing us because what they built was a really comfortable outdoor shaded chaise lounge that gave them the ability to relax outside in a way they had never even thought about before. So I do think value requires more than one technique. You can't just use one of these techniques and say, now I'm able to link everything to value. Instead, I think of it as a toolbox of techniques, and we will probably pull certain tools out depending on the challenges we're in and the situation that we're in. So impact mapping in my little toolbox is more of a strategic planning technique than anything else. It helps people understand the big picture. It helps me give a goal or a set of goals that everybody understands. They know why we're building what we're building. What are we trying to do with this? Where are we trying to go? It helps us understand assumptions that we're making. If we build this feature, we think it will make this change in our user community so that we will be able to get to this goal. And it allows you to understand and prioritize all of the potential changes that you might make to help you inform milestones or help you inform your roadmap. So this is, I think, a big picture value technique and can be easily supplemented by things like story mapping or user stories, Scrum, Kanban, all of the things that help us take, now that we know where we're going, we understand the big picture features we're going to, how do we now continue that focus on value as the project goes along? So what is this thing called impact mapping? The manifesto for impact mapping is that we build the right thing, we build great things when we all understand why. Why are we doing what we're doing? I think it also provides great motivation when people have a really good understanding of what we're trying to do as a business, or how what we're building is really going to impact and affect our user community. I think that gets people very excited and motivated. So we want to understand why. Then we need to understand who can actually help us achieve this goal. It might be people inside the organization. It might be people outside the organization. It might be our users. Honestly, it's probably a combination of more than one kind of person. And then we think about, what is the outcome or the impact that we need to make for those people or on those people's workflow or jobs to help really move towards that goal. And then finally, we create or sometimes map existing features into those impacts. So how does this deliverable or this feature actually help? Which of these impacts does it enable for us to be able to move towards this larger goal? So we always start with a collaborative process. This is very much intended to bring together business representatives and technical staff to talk about, what are we trying to accomplish? Who can help us accomplish that? How do we change or enable somebody's behavior? What can they start doing now they couldn't do before? What are maybe we going to have them not have to do anymore? Can we relieve some uh, administration work or some burden work that isn't necessarily value add, so we can free them up to do things that are actually more beneficial to them? And then finally, that features or functionalities that we can use to support the change in behavior. An impact map looks like, almost looks like a mind map, really, in that it all ties back to a central node. It all ties back to that goal. So we start with that goal, then we start to brainstorm the actors in the organization who will help us towards that goal, then our impacts, then our scope. I've seen some people who have done it as just like a giant wall where you have a goal at the start and then everything spans out. I've also seen people do it in rings where the goal is in the middle, the actors are around the central goal, the impacts connect to the actors in a third ring, and then finally the deliverables or functionality is on the outer ring. So you can play around a little bit with the presentation of these, as long as you have this idea of, there's a goal, and everything that we're building links through actors and the changes, the impact we're going to have on those people back to the goal. So a little tiny example of all of this, we have our goal of reducing student registration costs by 30%. We have a set of actors who can help us get us here. Here we see one, it's the student, but likely there are others. The student, perhaps the student advisor, perhaps the people who work in the registration office. From there, for our student, what do we actually want to change? So here we're building a registration portal for our students. And what we want to do is allow them to register themselves. Instead of having to come in and register, we want to give them a portal so that they could register at 5 in the morning if they happen to be up, or midnight if they're still studying, anytime they want, anywhere they want, rather than having to come in with their list of classes they want into the building to do their registration. So we want to change that behavior where they now self-register themselves. And now from that, we can start thinking about, well, if they're going to register, what do they need to be able to do? Well, they need to be able to browse the course catalog to see what classes are available. They need to do that registration. They need to receive course recommendations from their advisors so they know what their advisors think they should be taking in the next semester or next quarter. So that's a little segment of what would be a significantly larger map for more than one release in a large product that's being built. So it all starts with a goal. We want to make sure we have a good goal, right? A goal like move to technology X, not a good goal. Why? Why are we moving to technology X? What benefit do we actually expect when we have technology X? And I see a lot of goals start with this idea of, we want to do something. And again, 5 whys is a wonderful technique for these kinds of things. you just ask yourself why up to 5 times to move away from the solution. Humans typically come to us with solutions. They don't come to us with their problems. I've already thought about what my problem is. I have a pretty good feel for what I think you should build for me. So with goals, with features, um, it's often necessary to kind of back people away for what they're initially saying to help really understand what are we trying to do. So I'd like to see goals that talk about things more like, we're moving to this technology because we think it'll increase the stability of the site so that we can have 95% uptime, and that's going to help us reduce our customer churn. Or we think it'll reduce the deployment failures that we're having by 80%. And you may have more than one goal. It's not uncommon to have a couple of these. And when I do my presentation, I'll also talk about something called a landing zone where you can have more than one goal. So increased site stability by 95% to 95% uptime is a pretty good goal. An even better goal is to really go through, it's rare that a single number represents success or failure in goals. They're kind of like non-functional requirements. There's often a range of acceptable outcomes. There's a certain level where if we can't get at least here, we just shouldn't have spent the money on this, right? It's a complete waste. Or maybe if you're building something brand new, it represents failure in the marketplace. There's a goal, there's a target we would like to get to. And there's often a level that's sort of like, hey, if we can get to this area called outstanding, I would throw you guys a party. It is in the realm of possibility that we can get here. It's likely. It's not like, oh, we're going to get to 100% uptime and we're currently at 50. It needs to be something that is reasonably likely to happen. But it might make, if everything goes right, we would probably get here. So taking goals and instead of just saying there's a single digit number, giving me the range of acceptable outcomes from a minimum to a target to an outstanding gives me a little bit more flexibility to manage the project to a successful outcome. Also, talking through, well, how are we going to actually measure this? What is our scale? What is our meter? How are we going to actually be able to check and see if we've gotten to this particular goal? That's like the penultimate goal. And if all that sounds interesting, stay tuned in April. We'll go into all of this more. This comes out of a lot of the work that Tom Guild did in quantifying stakeholder goals. So more on that in April if you're interested. Now we have our goal. We need to start thinking about all the different people who can help us achieve that goal. And a lot of times people will immediately just think of the direct end user that's going to be using it day in and day out, the person whose hands are on the keyboard actively typing every single day. But there's lots of other people who are part of this landscape that we should be thinking of. There are indirect users. These are people who receive the results. So maybe I have the clerks or the partners who work in the store day in and day out doing things. But then I also have a regional manager who gets all of the sales results for all of the stores in the Pacific Northwest region. They're not using that system day in and day out, but boy, they are really interested in getting the information. And in fact, sometimes these people who are indirect users can really be sort of the key people we're trying to target for. If you think about expense management software, we want to make sure the people who are putting their expenses in are pretty happy, but we want to make sure the people who are able to manage the expenses for the corporation think our software is amazingly helpful to them. There's also often internal users, professional services engineers, technical support, marketing, or downstream upstream partners is another way to think of it. The operations engineers might be a downstream partner. There may be OEMs or other people that we interact with that we need to make sure that we make happy. I always say cast a wide net and then start to prioritize. And sometimes really thinking about this is very helpful because the biggest change that we can make, the actor who can help us make changes more quickly, may not always be the direct user of the system. Maybe if we provide a little bit of support for our professional services firm or our ops folks, maybe that will move the needle really, really quickly for us in a way we hadn't thought of if we think just about the direct users of the system. So we go through and brainstorm all of the different actors, and then we start looking at the actors compared to the goal and start having conversations about which of these particular people or class of people can help us move the needle on our goal. Who's going to be able to most help us increase the site stability or reduce the customer churn or increase customer satisfaction? Who do we think is going to be able to have the biggest impact? And maybe that there's a couple that really spring to mind, and we're starting to make some assumptions here. If we enable this person, we think that's most likely going to help us move towards the goal. So a big thing in impact mapping is every step of the way, we're starting to talk about some of these assumptions. And as we start to look at the impact map and prioritize the impact map, we can also talk about what assumptions do we need to test or validate to make sure this will work properly. I find the hardest thing for people to think about is the impact piece of the impact map. People tend here to really want to talk about features. This is where they jump into, if we build X, that will be it. But we're not there quite yet. That's the last piece of the map. Really in the impacts, we're talking about what behavior changes do we want to see? So for our student, what do we want them to be able to start doing that they can't do today? So today they can't register themselves. We want to enable them to do that. Or what do we want them to stop doing? Something they are doing today that we'd like them to stop. One of the very early Scrum projects that I worked on was built around this desire to help a drug management portfolio pipeline. They had some really important decision makers who were spending a lot of time custom building Excel spreadsheets to get data to help them make decisions. And they wanted to automate some of that data gathering to get some of the information that was commonly used by everybody so that they could just make that readily available to people and they wouldn't have to spend time mucking around in Excel and instead could just go to this dashboard and get some key information to help them make decisions. So we're trying to stop having them spend all of that time in Excel and instead be able to spend some of their time in other areas that are more useful to them and to us as a business. And finally, there may be some things we want them to do differently. We want them to be able to do it more quickly, or we want them to be able to do it with fewer errors that occur as they do the activity that they're doing. So don't just list software ideas yet. Think about the user, what they can do once we give them that capability, or what they can do that will help us move towards the goal, really. It is, okay, we want to reduce registration expenses by 30%. What could the student do differently? Start doing, stop doing, that would help us move the needle on that goal. And that's what we want to be thinking about when we're thinking about the impacts. So here we're thinking about they're self-registering for courses. We're processing fewer exception cases. We're going to allow the student registration system to do some of that exception handling for us so that the students don't have to deal with it as much and the registration clerks don't have to do it as much. And we want to be able to fix registration errors faster because there'll be way fewer registration issues for the clerks to focus on, and so they can really fix just those gnarly exceptions that happen every once in a while during the quarter. I like impact mapping because I think it's really simple. It's pretty easy to explain to people. It's easy to remember. It's easy to create. You can use something like Miro or Miro if you're doing this in our virtual world of brainstorming. I love techniques that are visual. I'm a huge fan of story mapping for the same reason that it's very, very visual. I like the way that this connects the goals to the deliverables through the users of the system. Those are really the people who need to be able to do things differently or do new things that we're enabling. So I think this is a great collaboration technique to bring together people from technology and business to really align. And sometimes it's to bring together groups of people in the business to align. I've got 13 stakeholders that all kind of see different things they need. If we can have a single shared goal across all of those internal stakeholders in my organization, that's going to make alignment and thinking about what we're all trying to accomplish much, much easier than everybody having little pieces that they think are useful. So sometimes this is really, really helpful for that. I've got a diverse group of people that we need to align on and figure out how to do something together. So now I have my impact map. What does that mean for actually sequencing my value? We're going to start by prioritizing our impacts rather than our deliverables. So I'm not going to go through and prioritize my features. What I'm going to do is I'm going to step back, look at the map, and ask myself questions like, which impact is going to move the needle most for our goal? Which one is going to provide us the most useful change that will make us move towards that goal most quickly? Is there an assumption in here that we're making that we really ought to test quickly, maybe simply, maybe super simply, to make sure that's going to make us really know whether or not this change is going to be a big change or a small change? Sometimes we are making a lot of assumptions, right? Here we're really sure our students are going to self-register. Well, maybe we give them something really quick and simple just to test that, yep, they all have access to the technology. It's going to work out for us to head this direction. So I'm thinking about two big things when I'm looking at this. First, I'm prioritizing my impact, and I'm looking at it through the lens of the goal. Which one is going to make the biggest needle there? And then I'm thinking about which are the kind of big nut assumptions here, AKA risks, that we need to test out and we need to try. Impact mapping also can impact either a set of milestones or a set of releases we're thinking about. I can go through and prioritize those impacts and then think about what's the smallest meaningful set that I can release that provides value to people. So we might say release number 1 is going to be simple self-registration. It's going to be for the students. They're going to get a separate email with advisor recommendations that's totally different. We're just going to give them the ability to look at classes that are available only for the upcoming quarter or semester. We're going to do some basic validations just to make sure that we don't cause them to be registering for all sorts of stuff that ends up not being available or they can't take it. But we're really going to focus on 1 quarter registration for a student. Our next release is going to be more advanced. We're going to provide some advanced searching. We're going to allow people to look maybe in course catalogs for the year to see whether or not they really ought to take something this quarter or next quarter. They'll get their advisor recommendations available in the registration process. So in thinking through those impacts and prioritizing those impacts, we can then think about, well, here are the impacts in the sequence we think will move us most towards those goals. And impact maps make great inputs into backlogs. You can start walking through the features and functionalities. You take something like register for courses, and you could immediately start breaking that down into the major components of that. I need to be able to search for classes. I need to know whether or not I can take a class. Do I have the prerequisites for that class? I want to see a schedule of offerings if there's more than one to be able to take one. And all of those can be written in the user story format. to help us keep that lens of value for the student as we move out of the impact map and into, say, Scrum or Kanban or other Agile delivery techniques. And here's where we'll also start thinking about things like MVPs. I always joke that when you take something like register for courses and you start to break that down into the sub elements underneath it, within every feature is a minimum viable feature just struggling to get out. So as we start to break those down and start to build our backlog, I start thinking about things like, do I really need that in this release, or can it be in the next release? Is that really important? Is that part of our MVP? Is that part of our minimum viable experiment, even, to see if this is a good idea? I might go back to the impact map to start looking at the children's stories underneath that larger feature and prioritizing those. Which of these stories is going to help best support the actors' behaviors in support of our goals, to prioritize that? Also, those assumptions, where do those live in this backlog, to make sure I don't build a bunch of stuff and then suddenly realize I have an assumption that invalidates everything that we built. So impact mapping is a collaborative visual tool. The big thing is it helps us understand, why are we building this? It gives us that shared alignment and then that shared conversation about the impacts and the users that are going to move the needle on that goal we're trying to do. It's really the most powerful when the goals are specific and concrete and measurable. So if that sounds interesting, come back in April. Love this technique for surfacing assumptions. And this is a great technique for doing initial sequencing for a roadmap or a milestone plan that we use. Right, Devin, maybe give folks a little bit of information about things that are available beyond this webinar.
Before we do that, we have some questions, Jenny.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So you talked about the power of mapping generally, and the first question says, is there any relationship between impact mapping and story mapping?
They could be used very, very collaboratively together if people thought that was useful. So what I would do if I was doing both of them, I would do an impact map first. That gives me those big deliverables that I'm trying to accomplish. I would prioritize my impacts. So now I know the big deliverables that we're kind of eyeballing for our first release. I would take those into story mapping and doing a story mapping exercise. I have the actor, I have the epic or the feature or whatever you want to call that big chunk of functionality. Now starting to go through the idea of how do I decompose that maybe into workflow steps that give me a walking skeleton, and then kind of the major stories underneath each of those workflows that incrementally builds out the workflow to add more and more value to the user, until we reach that cutoff line where we start to say, don't really need this for release 1 or for the MVP.
Excellent. Next question. You acknowledge that impacts are the hardest part for people to think about. So do you have any just further tips or tricks for people to consider, since that seems to be a tough step here in terms of people's, approach to this?
It is. I mean, I think it is just human behavior to want to offer a solution. And so I will, when we're brainstorming things like the impact, when people offer a, a solution, I take it and then I start to ask questions about it, right? I'll kind of look at it and say, that still smells like a feature to me. So, okay, if this was in place, what would user X be able to do now they can't do today? Or if I read it and think it's actually about maybe being able to stop something, uh, you know, okay, well, if this was an X, how would that free up these people's time? What would be different in their day-to-day work activities because we now have this available? Or what would be different in what people are doing? So just go back to that lens of the impact, start doing, stop doing, do differently, and just ask a few questions. And out of that, generally the impact will show up.
Cool. Next question. Do you have any favorite techniques to combine with impact mapping?
I really love actual stakeholder quantification, the Guild stakeholder quantification applied to the goals in the impact map.
Which is your next topic, right?
Which is my next topic, yes. Yep. And I do think combining impact mapping with story mapping, I'm a huge fan of story mapping. So if you're in a position where it makes sense to go through and do story mapping because you need to get a better understanding of what you're building, or maybe your organization has strong need for predictability and I need to build a story map so that I can give them a rough estimate of when we're going to be done with this. And I definitely think that taking things out of an impact map and moving them into a user story format and user stories in your backlog connects up really nicely and keeps you focused on value as you go.
Great. Looks like we have just one more about various approaches. Does it matter if I'm using Kanban, Scrum, Safe, etc.? Do any of those affect any of this?
Nope.
Simple answer.
I mean, I really think of Kanban and Scrum and Safe, especially Safe when you're talking about what the teams are doing. Those are wonderful kind of value delivery engines. And this thing called a product backlog is the fuel that feeds the car of Scrum or Kanban driving down the road. And if I can make sure that it's good quality fuel and that the car is pointed in the right direction. We know we want to be driving down to California because we want some sun. We're in Seattle right now, so sun would be nice. So we're heading there, not heading over to Chicago. You know, those are the kind of things that impact mapping really helps with, is making sure we all know where we're going and why we're going there, and that the stories within the backlog really link up to that. And then whether you deliver it with Safe, Scrum, Kanban, XP, have at it, whatever works well in your organization.
Yeah, makes sense. Great. That's it for the questions. Everybody, as you can see on this slide, we have all sorts of free resources for you on our website, including lots of episodes of our Inspect and Adapt podcast. So head on over there to check those things out. And Jenny, if you would go to the last slide, I just want to call out an email address, everyone. If you have any questions about our services or simply have questions for any of our consultants, such as Jenny, write us at info@construx.com. We'll be happy to respond. Thank you, Jenny, so much, and thank you all for attending. We'll see you again, we hope.